Long before Alexander's conquests, the rivalries of Athens and Sparta, or the victories in the Persian Wars, there existed a world of splendor and chaos, a time when the lines between myth and reality blurred. It is here, in the heart of a bygone era of Mycenaean Greece, that the seeds of the greatest tales were sown, the stories of vengeance, love and war that would echo through the ages. The whispers of mighty Troy still haunt the ruins of Anatolia, while the tales of fearsome warriors like Achilles and Hector, Odysseus and Paris inspire awe to this day. However, beneath the surface of this mythical grandeur, traces of an ancient and powerful civilization linger. As the Neolithic slowly gave way to the early Bronze Age at the turn of the 3rd millennium BCE, humans started coalescing in larger population centers. Bronze working, first developed in Anatolia, reached Greece around 3200 BC, sparking the technological revolution and giving the period its name. Greece was home to 3 distinct Bronze Age cultures that evolved more or less simultaneously. These were the Helladic, confined to mainland Greece, the Cycladic, found on the islands of the Aegean Sea, and the Minoan, on the island of Crete. Although located in Greece, these cultures were not Greek themselves. The region flourished during the early Bronze Age, developing a complex and rich society. Then suddenly, around 2300 BCE, a wave of destruction washed over the Helladic culture on the mainland. Several notable sites were left in ruins, and the region regressed to a simpler and poorer state. This destruction is attributed to a migration of people, the Proto-Greeks, who arrived from the north. These new inhabitants would take almost 1,000 years to reach the sophistication of the destroyed Helladic culture. While the Greeks on the mainland were struggling to catch up to their predecessors, the Minoans on Crete continued thriving. They developed a complex trade network, first with the Cyclades and later with Egypt and Syria. The adoption of the masted ships allowed the Minoans to sail further, reaching both Africa and Asia. These newly opened trade routes brought exotic and rare goods, such as gold and ivory, essential for the emerging elites. Several large population centers sprang up around the island. Some located on the coast were focused on trade, while others located further inland were focused on agriculture. These towns continued growing rapidly, and at the turn of the 2nd millennium BCE, the first palaces began appearing on Crete. The Minoans got their name from the mythical king Minos, who built one of these palaces to house the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature. In total, 5 palatial centers were discovered on the island, the largest of which is located in Knossos. The palaces were large, maze-like complexes that served multiple purposes. It was generally believed that the palaces were the seats of a combined political, economic, and religious authority for their respective regions. However, recent archaeological evidence tells a different story. Large caches of both plain and elaborate pottery suggest that the palaces were used by the commoners and the elites alike. With the emergence of palaces came the development of writing, first the Cretan hieroglyphs, followed by the later Linear A script. Neither of these scripts has been deciphered yet. Linear A was developed around 1800 BC. It is a logosyllabic language, meaning it includes signs representing words or ideas and others representing syllables. Large amounts of Linear A tablets discovered in palaces suggest that they served as administration centers. The Minoan economy was based on the redistribution of goods. All excess production was stored within palaces and later distributed among the citizens based on their needs. The walls of the palaces were elaborately decorated. Surviving frescoes depict the ruling elites engaged in religious ceremonies or scenes featuring various animals. The most striking recurring motif is the depiction of male and female figures leaping over a charging bull. The bull was a sacred creature on ancient Crete, represented in numerous paintings and statues. This fascination with bulls would, over time, evolve into stories of the mythical Minotaur dwelling on the island. All forms of warfare are conspicuously absent from Minoan artworks. Further lack of any significant fortifications on the island, alongside the absence of weapons in burial sites, led archaeologists to believe that the Minoans were a peaceful society. However, as new evidence surfaced, the historians re-examined the myth of the Minoan peace. Large amounts of wealth gathered through trade would have surely attracted raiders and pirates looking for an easy target. Although the settlements had no real fortifications, the archaeologists have found evidence of watchtowers scattered across the island. Combined with other findings, historians have concluded that the Minoans had a large navy to protect them from outside threats, while internal conflict on the island was rare or non-existent. The Minoan civilization continued thriving until the end of the Middle Bronze Age, when it was struck by a massive earthquake around 1700 BCE. Evidence of the earthquake can be found throughout the island. The palaces, along with other lesser buildings, were completely destroyed, but this would not be the end of this civilization. The palaces were rebuilt on an even grander scale, and the Minoans returned to business as usual. Only 100 years later, the Aegean would witness another, even greater catastrophe. Thera volcano on the Greek island of Santorini erupted around 1600 BC. This was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. Although it destroyed some of the settlements in the Cyclades and forced others in the northeast of Crete to be abandoned due to volcanic ash, the Minoan civilization at large survived. Palaces like Knossos not only survived, but thrived in the aftermath of the explosion. This directly contradicts some theories claiming that the Minoans were destroyed by the eruption. Natural disasters may have threatened the Minoan way of life on several occasions, but it was the Greeks who would ultimately bring Europe's first civilization to an early end. During the Middle Bronze Age, the Greek mainland was a cultural backwater compared to the sophisticated Minoan society on nearby Crete. However, as the end of the Middle Bronze Age was drawing close, there was a notable increase in the number of settlements and the wealth of the population. Increased contact with the Minoan civilization no doubt played a role in this cultural revival. Starting around 1750 BC, the first signs of a new civilization appeared on the mainland. The Greeks, who had arrived some 600 years earlier, finally coalesced into an advanced society known as Mycenaean Greece. The city of Mycenae, the namesake of this civilization, is the best preserved archaeological site of the era. Like the pharaohs of Egypt, the early Mycenaean rulers were more focused on their afterlives than their actual lives. Around the city of Mycenae, two large grave circles were discovered. It is believed that they belonged to two rival ruling families. Grave Circle B, the older of the two, shows a clear increase in wealth from the Middle to the Late Bronze Age. Around 1600 BC, Grave Circle A overtook its counterpart to become the main resting place of the nobility for the next 150 years. This period is known as the Shaft Grave Era, deriving its name from the elaborate tombs within Circle A. The men buried in these graves were warriors, as evidenced by the large number of weapons accompanying them. The riches buried in Circle A far surpass those found in Circle B. Elaborate gold items, made from thin sheets too fragile for everyday use, are a common occurrence. One of the most iconic artifacts of this era is the Mask of Agamemnon, a golden burial mask found in Circle A. It was once believed that it belonged to the legendary king Agamemnon, who led the Achaeans in the Trojan War. Although an impressive find, the archaeological evidence suggests that the mask predates the war by some 400 years. Although the shaft graves defined this era, they were in fact quite uncommon. The rest of the Mycenaean world preferred large chamber tombs known as tholos tombs, which can be found scattered across mainland Greece. The shaft grave era is notable for the large amount of wealth gathered by the Mycenaean elites. The source of this wealth were the large mines of Laurion, located in southern Attica. These mines were a source of silver, lead, and most importantly copper. Bronze Age societies were dependent on copper, and a local supply gave the Greeks an upper hand. With increased activity in these mines, the Mycenaeans joined the lucrative trade networks of the eastern Mediterranean. Luxury goods produced in faraway places could now be found throughout the Mycenaean world. Tin and gold, two crucial metals, were not found in Greece and had to be imported from far away. By the middle of the 15th century BC, the last burial had been made in the shaft graves of Mycenae, and the winds of change were beginning to blow across the Aegean. The Minoans, who were the dominant power in the area for millennia, suffered a great reversal of fortune. Around 1450 BC, a wave of destruction washed over across Crete. All but one palace complex was destroyed, along with numerous towns and country villas. Although the town of Knossos shows some evidence of a fire, the palace complex there did survive. Many theories were put forth to explain this disaster, but the most convincing and widely accepted one is the violent arrival of the Mycenaeans. Following this destruction, tablets bearing a new script started appearing on the island. The Mycenaeans adopted Linear A, utilizing it to write the Greek language. This new script is known as Linear B, and it represents the first instance of the written Greek language. Unlike Linear A, it is a syllabic script, meaning that the Greeks dropped the hieroglyphic component. Large numbers of tablets bearing Linear B found on Crete support the theory of the Mycenaean invasion. Although knowledge of the Minoan civilization was lost to the ancient world, the myths passed down through the Dark Ages tells a surprisingly plausible story. The classical Greeks told of the mythical king Minos, who established a naval empire in the Aegean and cleared the sea of pirates. They told of a great labyrinth built to house the Minotaur. And lastly, they told of a young Athenian hero, Theseus, who sailed to Crete and killed the great beast, finally freeing Athens from Minoan tyranny. From these myths, we can see that the ancient Greeks remembered the great naval empire of the Minoans. They remembered the palaces and the bold culture of the island. They also remembered the Mycenaean invasion. For millennia, these myths were thought to be mere fiction until the archaeologist Arthur Evans discovered the ruins of Knossos at the start of the 20th century. As more and more information was uncovered from the ruins, we gradually found more and more truth in these ancient myths. In time, the Mycenaeans rose to fill the void left by the fall of the Minoans, becoming the preeminent power in the Aegean. The surrounding islands proved convenient stopping points along the trade routes, and a large number of Mycenaean settlements appeared on their shores. The Mycenaeans would gradually expand their trade routes from the Aegean to the distant shores of Italy, Syria, and Egypt. There is evidence of direct contact between the Mycenaeans and the Egyptians during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. Carved tablets depicting the pharaoh and his wife have been found in Mycenae and Tyrannis, while the list of palace complexes had been inscribed on a statue in Egypt. With increased trade, the Mycenaean elites amassed large amounts of wealth. During these times, the first proto-palatial complexes emerged in Minoan Greece. Cities like Thebes, Pylos, Athens, and Menelaon rose to become great regional centers. Although a dominant power in the region, the Mycenaeans were not free from danger. Around the mid-14th century, several notable sites, including Mycenae, Athens, Nicoria, and Menelaon, showed signs of destruction. The damage was also present on Crete, where the palace of Knossos met its final end. A small group of the indigenous Minoans dwelt in the ruins of the palace for some time. However, by the late Bronze Age collapse, they too would vanish, and the palace was abandoned for good. The source of this destruction remains unknown. Whatever the case may be, the Mycenaeans would quickly recover and enter into a period of hegemony over the Aegean. This period is characterized by large monumental buildings, thriving settlements, and rich burial sites. A highly uniform culture now spread across the Greek mainland and the surrounding islands. Following this bout of destruction, the Mycenaean rulers recognized the need for strong fortifications. Around 1350 BC, the Mycenaean Acropolis was encircled by a massive wall built from large limestone blocks. The walls were as many as 8 meters thick at some points. Around 100 years later, the walls were expanded to include the surrounding buildings, nearly tripling the fortified area. Grave Circle A, previously mentioned in the video, was now secured within the city walls, while Circle B remained outside. During this expansion, Circle A was reconstructed into a cultic site for religious rituals. This gives us some indication that the Mycenaean rulers still revered the ancient kings lying in those tombs. The famous Lion Gate, marking the entrance to Mycenae even today, was part of this expansion. A large palace was built atop the Acropolis. Unlike their Minoan counterparts, the Mycenaean palaces did house the royal families. But borrowing some elements from the past, they still retained communal functionality, namely the redistribution of grain. The classical Greeks were so impressed by the magnitude of these fortifications that they called them Cyclopean walls. They believed only the mythical Cyclops could have constructed such monumental structures. Nearby to Mycenae stood Tyrannis, a heavily fortified coastal town with a palace complex. The walls of Tyrannis are the best preserved example of Cyclopean masonry today. Given its proximity to Mycenae, it's believed that the city was under the influence of its larger neighbor. Close to the sea, Tyrannis might have served as an important trading hub during the Bronze Age. To the east of these cities stood a third fortified city in Argolid, Medea. Impressive walls, rich burial sites, and a number of luxury items found in the city suggest that Medea also had a palace complex. However, no tablets have yet been found in the city to confirm it functioned as a redistribution center. On the western Peloponnese, in Messenia, stood the city of Pylos. Pylos is home to the Palace of Nestor, a grand palatial complex named after the Homeric hero. Unused since the Bronze Age collapse, it is the best preserved Mycenaean palace. The city is notable for a large number of frescoes depicting Minoan imagery. Like others, Pylos was heavily fortified. Several other notable sites were found all across Greece. These include Thebes, one of the wealthiest cities of the era, which is sadly buried under a modern settlement and largely inaccessible to archaeologists. Athens, with evidence of Cyclopean masonry beneath the foundations of the Acropolis. Iolkos, a coastal town on the shores of the Aegean, featured in the myth of Jason and the Argonauts. Orchomenus, the home of the exceptionally wealthy people known as the Minoans, mentioned by Homer, along with many other smaller settlements. Among the numerous Mycenaean sites across Greece, there are some places of legend still missing, notably the palace of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Extensive excavation operations have uncovered an ancient settlement in the right spot, but any evidence of a large palace-like structure is yet to be uncovered. However, there is still reason to be hopeful. Some ancient sites, buried for centuries, have been discovered just recently. The excavations are still ongoing on the palace of Odysseus on Ithaca and the home of Ajax the Great on the island of Salamis. All these settlements, both large and small, continued thriving throughout the 13th century when all civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean were thrown into chaos. But before we can discuss the late Bronze Age collapse, we must first examine the most important literary source from this era. As we have already alluded to several times, the epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to the blind poet Homer, portray the world of Mycenaean Greece in the late Bronze Age. Unfortunately for us, Homer lived at least 400 years after the events described in his works. These poems were passed down for generations from one poet to another, until they were finally written down around the 8th century BC. During these times, the poems evolved, with each generation of poets adding their own spin and embellishments to the story. What possibly began as an accurate historical retelling evolved into an immense conflict involving powerful deities using mortals as mere proxies. The Iliad covers some major events in the final weeks of the 10-year-long Trojan War, while the Odyssey follows the Greek hero Odysseus during the last days of his voyage home from the war. The rest of the Trojan War is told through a series of epic poems known as the epic cycle. Unlike the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have been preserved in their entirety, the 6 poems of the epic cycle survive only in fragments and summaries from later authors. The 2 Homeric epics, along with the summaries of the epic cycle, allow us to piece together the build-up to the war and the course of the 10-year-long conflict. During the last gathering of the immortals our world would ever know, the goddess of strife and discord, Eris, threw a golden apple at Zeus. An inscription on the apple read, "For the most beautiful." Unable to choose between his wife Hera, his favorite daughter Athena, and the goddess of love and beauty Aphrodite, Zeus passed the decision to a mortal man, Paris of Troy. The 3 goddesses, craving the apple and the accompanying title, promised Paris great gifts in return. Hera, queen of Olympus, spoke first, offering Paris power beyond his wildest dreams. With this power, he could build the greatest empire known to man. Hera was followed by Athena, the goddess of wisdom, who offered Paris the gift of wisdom surpassing that of any mortal, past, present, or future. With this gift, he could build an empire if he so chose, or do any other extraordinary thing he saw fit. Lastly spoke Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. She couldn't offer Paris great empires or mastery of the mind. Aphrodite could only offer him love. Only the love of the most beautiful woman in all of Greece, Helen of Sparta. Upon seeing her face, Paris fell madly in love and gave the apple of discord to Aphrodite, unknowingly sealing the fate of his city. For, you see, Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Years ago, Menelaus won Helen's hand in a contest, while every other suitor, and there were many, had to swear an oath to protect the young couple. Sometime after the encounter with the immortals, Paris embarked on a diplomatic mission to the Peloponnese. He was greeted like a king in Sparta, where he finally met Helen, who was even more beautiful than he remembered. Guided by Aphrodite's immortal hand, Helen immediately fell in love with Paris. When his host left Sparta on urgent business, Paris ransacked the palace and eloped with Helen back to Troy. When Menelaus returned to find his home abandoned, he was furious. His brother, Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae and the high king of the Achaeans, was even more so. He called up his banners and summoned all suitors to fulfill their oaths. They all answered the call, and the largest Greek host ever recorded was assembled. Great kings, princelings, warlords, and nobles from all across the Greek world gathered at Aulis. Among them were the 2 brothers, Agamemnon and Menelaus, Nestor, the king of Pylos, with his son Antilochus, the cunning Odysseus, the mighty Ajax, the daring Diomedes, and the foremost among these great warriors, Achilles, with his friend Patroclus. As many as 1,200 ships, with more than 140,000 men on board, accompanied the expedition. When all the necessary preparations were made and the favorable winds arose, the mighty host of the Achaeans set off from Greece. Many would never return to their homes. King Priam and his sons Hector and Paris were preparing the city defenses in anticipation of Greek reprisal. But the Trojans didn't stand alone. They had numerous allies aiding them throughout the war, from the Paeonians and Thracians in the north to many Anatolian tribes, including the mighty warrior women, the Amazons. They would all have an important role to play in the years to come. As the Trojan sentries observed the plain of Ilium, an endless row of ships appeared on the horizon. The Trojans were expecting an attack, but the Achaeans arrived in force. Hector rushed out with his men and quickly organized the defenses of the beach. Protesilaus was the first Achaean to land on Trojan soil. He pushed back the enemy but was eventually slain by Hector in single combat, thus becoming the first Greek casualty of the war. For a brief period, the Trojans had the upper hand, and the Achaeans were struggling to set up a beachhead. It is then that Achilles charged the Trojan line and killed one of their heroes. Seeing this, the defenders lost heart and retreated back to the city. The Greeks constructed a fortified camp on the beach. This would be their new home for the foreseeable future. While the men were fighting their battles on the ground, the gods were aiding and directing them as they saw fit. The archer gods, Apollo and his twin sister Artemis, were the protectors of Troy. They were joined by Aphrodite and her lover Ares, the god of war, who defended Paris and his new wife Helen. The Achaeans had protectors of their own. The goddesses Hera and Athena, slighted by Paris, wanted to see Troy burn. Hephaestus, god of the forges and husband to Aphrodite, sided against his unfaithful wife. These three were joined by Poseidon, the god of the seas. He had children on both sides of the conflict, but always preferred the Greeks more. King of Olympus, Zeus, took the role of a grand arbiter, yet he was willing to look the other way for the right price. The god of the underworld, Hades, was simply pleased that the war had broken out. Great men from both sides would soon descend into his eternal halls. Several other smaller deities and immortal beings of all sorts joined one side or the other. For 9 long years, the Greeks besieged Troy, with neither side able to gain a significant advantage. During this time, the Achaeans raided nearby towns, seizing valuable supplies, gold, and slaves. It is now in the 10th year that Homer picks up the narrative. One of the slaves taken by Agamemnon was Chryseis, a daughter of the priest of Apollo. Her father offered a hefty sum of gold for her return, but he was refused. Angered by this insult, Apollo rained plague arrows upon the Achaeans. After 9 perilous days, Agamemnon finally agreed to return Chryseis, but not before taking a slave woman from Achilles. This was a grave mistake, as the young, hot-headed warrior was so enraged that he refused to fight with the Achaeans any longer. With Achilles and his elite Myrmidons out of the picture, Agamemnon marched the rest of his forces to the gates of Troy. Before a battle could be joined, Paris offered to fight Menelaus in single combat. The victor would claim Helen, and the Greeks would depart for their homeland, thus finally bringing an end to the war. Paris was a skilled warrior, but he was no match for the great Menelaus of Sparta. The king gained the upper hand, but before he could strike the final blow, Paris was whisked away by Aphrodite. Menelaus was left alone on the battlefield. It slowly dawned on him that he had won. Helen would be his once more. They could finally go home. Cheers erupted from both sides as the men realized the war was finally over. But the Olympians were not done yet. Hera and Athena would settle for no less than the complete destruction of Troy. Amid the cheers, a single Trojan archer, guided by Hera's immortal hand, fired an arrow at Menelaus. His aim was true, striking Menelaus in the leg. Upon seeing this, the enraged Greeks charged the Trojan line. The first pitched battle of the war was joined on the plain of Ilium. Fighting was fierce on both sides, and even the Olympians joined in. Ares, the god of war himself, fought among the Trojans. He killed countless men until the Greek hero Diomedes, aided by Athena, wounded the great foe, forcing him back to Olympus. Hoping to stop further bloodshed, Hector challenged the Achaeans to single combat. Several notable men stepped forward to answer the challenge, and Ajax the Great was chosen by lot. The two men fought a legendary duel in front of the two armies. However, they were so evenly matched that neither could gain the upper hand. In the end, their duel was interrupted by nightfall. Before departing the battlefield, the warriors exchanged priceless gifts. Ajax presented his great belt, while receiving Hector's silver sword. These items would later play prominent parts in their respective deaths. When fighting was next joined, the Trojans, led by Hector, came on with such force that they pushed the Achaeans all the way back to their ships. There was only one Greek warrior who was a match for Hector, but he was still sulking in his tent. Realizing his cause was about to collapse, Agamemnon finally recognized the folly of his actions. He offered Achilles apologies and kingly gifts in return for his assistance. Yet Achilles, prideful as ever, refused him. Without their best warrior, the Achaeans were powerless to stop the Trojan onslaught. Hector fought like a man possessed, successfully breaching the defensive perimeter. Agamemnon, Odysseus, and Diomedes were all wounded, and all hope seemed lost. Ajax the Great now stood alone between the Trojans and the ships. At this dire moment, a warrior in shining armor appeared in the distance. Patroclus donned the armor of Achilles. Behind him, a legion of elite Myrmidons hungry for war. This disguise tricked both friends and foes. The Achaeans rallied behind him and pushed back the Trojans. Blinded by rage, Patroclus pursued the fleeing enemy all the way to their walls. Apollo could not tolerate a mere mortal threatening his great city. With his aid, Hector led a successful counterattack, killing Patroclus in the process. Realizing it was not Achilles who pursued them, the Trojans rallied behind Hector. A fierce brawl broke out over the body of Patroclus. When Achilles got the news that his dearest friend and lover had been slain, he was stricken with immense grief. Now armorless, Hephaestus, the smith god, forged him the greatest armor our world would ever know. As his grief slowly turned to rage, Achilles charged out of the camp. The mere sight of him was enough to throw the Trojans into disarray, and they rushed for the safety of their walls. Even though Achilles was unstoppable, one member of the royal family, Aeneas, did stand in his way. The princeling chose to fight, but he was no match for the mighty Achilles, who quickly gained the upper hand. However, before he could strike a final blow, Aeneas vanished in a cloud of dust. Poseidon, lord of the seas, foresaw that Aeneas had a great future ahead of him and whisked him off the battlefield. By now, all the Trojans had retreated back to the city. All but one. Hector stood alone before the gates as Achilles charged at him. Not even the great Hector could face Achilles in his rage, so he ran away in fear. For a time, Achilles chased after him until Athena tricked the Trojan prince, and the two men finally clashed. Zeus, the king of Olympus, didn't dare to intervene with fate, and Hector was slain in full view of his beloved city. Unsatisfied by his death, Achilles tied Hector's body to his chariot using Ajax's great belt and dragged him across the plain of Ilium for days. After the 12th day, Zeus decreed that this savagery must end. With help from the gods, King Priam snuck into the Achaean camp. He offered Achilles a great ransom for the body of his son. Still grieving, Achilles accepted, and Hector was given all the funeral rites. The Trojans were granted 12 days of peace to properly mourn their fallen hero. With this, Homer's Iliad comes to an end, and the rest of the war is recounted through the epic cycle. With the death of Hector, the Trojans were all but defeated. But as the Achaeans were mounting an assault on the city, the queen of the Amazons, Penthesilea, rode in with her warriors. They successfully pushed back the Achaeans to their ships, where Penthesilea was finally slain by Achilles. Seeing that he had killed a noble warrior woman, Achilles mourned her death. After the Amazons came Memnon, king of the Ethiopians, with his men, but they would suffer the same fate as the Amazons. Memnon rushed the old king Nestor, but before he could kill him, the king's son Antilochus sacrificed himself to save his father. Achilles then charged in to avenge his fallen friend. Memnon was a capable warrior, and he too wore armor made by the smith god Hephaestus. Even so, he could not match Achilles in single combat. No man could. He was slain, and Achilles pushed his way to the very gates of Troy. Paris was observing all of this from the ramparts, with his trusty bow at hand. He was one of the best archers of the war, but on that day he couldn't miss. His arrows were guided by the archer god Apollo, and his target was chosen by fate itself. Paris let loose one of his poisoned arrows. Whizzing through the air, it found its mark, hitting Achilles in the heel, the only vulnerable place on his body. The venom acted quickly, and the greatest warrior of legends finally met his end at the gates of Troy. The Trojans now charged, trying to take his body and his magnificent armor, but Ajax the Great stood in their path. With the help of Odysseus, he pushed back the Trojans and recovered the body of Achilles. Great sorrow descended upon the Achaean camp as they lit his funeral pyre. The histories would know many great warriors over the eons, but none as great as Achilles would ever walk this earth again. Following great funeral games held in his honor, it was time to bestow his legendary armor to one of the Greeks. The decision came down to two men who had rescued it from the clutches of Troy, Ajax and Odysseus. In the end, Odysseus was chosen as the victor and Ajax was driven mad with grief. He ended his life by jumping on Hector's silver sword, which he had received so long ago. The loss of two of their greatest warriors in such a short period of time took a toll on the Greeks. Some, including Menelaus, were even contemplating abandoning this foolish pursuit and returning home. However, their spirits were lifted by the arrival of two new warriors, Neoptolemus, a spitting image of his father Achilles, and Philoctetes, wielder of the mighty bow of Heracles. With their help, the Achaeans were destined to finally take Troy. Wearing his father's armor, Neoptolemus charged the Trojan walls with the formidable Myrmidons at hand. The Trojans could not believe their eyes. It was Achilles, born again to torment them. The Greeks successfully scaled the walls, and the city would have surely fallen that day if not for the thick mist that descended upon the plain of Ilium. Unable to see, the Myrmidons retreated back to their ships, resulting in yet another stalemate. During the next bout of fighting, Paris was leading his men in a desperate charge. Philoctetes, safe behind the Achaean lines, fired one of his arrows towards Paris, but only managed to graze him. Luckily, these were the arrows of Heracles, dipped in the poisonous blood of the Hydra. Paris was dead by nightfall. After bringing so much suffering to the city, few Trojans mourned his passing. Rather than returning Helen and ending the war, the two remaining Trojan princes, Deiphobus and Helenus, fell madly in love with her. Deiphobus, being the elder, got to marry the princess. Furious with his brother, Helenus left the city, but he was captured by Odysseus. While being questioned, Helenus told the Achaeans about the Palladium. Palladium was a mystical carving of the goddess Athena. It was foretold that as long as the Palladium remained within the city walls, Troy could never fall. Odysseus and Diomedes disguised themselves as beggars and entered the city. They stole the Palladium and delivered it to Agamemnon. Even though all of their great defenders were slain and their divine protection was gone, the walls of Troy remained as strong as ever. It will take more than sheer strength to topple them. It was now time for Odysseus to hatch a cunning plan. As the sun slowly rose over the plain of Ilium, all signs of the Greek force were gone. All that was left on the beach was a giant wooden horse. Their prayers were finally answered. Their enemy had vanished. Not only did the Achaeans retreat, but they also left a kingly gift. Although some Trojans were suspicious of the horse, King Priam ordered his men to bring it inside the city. The horse was so tall that they had to demolish part of the wall to fit it through. That day, great celebrations erupted throughout the city. Music could be heard from every corner. Every flagon of wine in the city was opened, and countless animals were sacrificed to the merciful gods. The festivities continued late into the night, but as the early morning was drawing near, all sounds in the city died down. It was then that something stirred around the horse. A trap door opened, and a number of Achaeans poured out. Quietly, they snuck through the city and opened the gates. Meanwhile, the Greek ships, hidden just out of view, landed on the beach, and the entire Achaean army rushed into the city. There are no words to describe the horrors that befell Troy that night. After 10 years of fighting and countless friends lost on the battlefield, the bitter Achaeans killed without mercy. Not even women and children were spared. Only Aeneas, leading a small group of refugees, managed to escape the slaughter. They recovered the Palladium from one of the temples near the city and set sail for the unknown. Years later, they would land near the mouth of the Tiber, where their descendants would found a city worthy of Troy. Back at Troy, Menelaus was rampaging through the royal palace in search of his Helen. He killed Deiphobus, and finally, after so many years, he was face to face with his beautiful wife. All this misery, all this death, just for her. Menelaus fell to his knees in tears. They can finally go home. While Troy was still engulfed in flames, the Greeks filled their ships with all kinds of treasure and set sail for their homeland. They would soon be home, all of them but one. The cunning Odysseus, the architect of this destruction, would wander the seas for 10 long years. But that's a story for another time. For centuries, it was believed that Homer's epics were mere fiction, until a German businessman turned archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, discovered the lost ruins of Troy in 1871. Schliemann would go on to excavate other notable sites, including Mycenae, where he would find the mask of Agamemnon. Unlike modern archaeologists who meticulously examine every aspect of a site, Schliemann blasted his way through the ruins, destroying countless artifacts in the process. The city of Troy was built and destroyed 9 separate times. Of these 9 layers, 2 present themselves as the best candidates for the legendary city: Troy 6 and Troy 7a. Troy 6 was a rich and powerful city. Positioned near the Hellespont, Troy was an important trading hub. It was the last safe harbor before the perilous journey to the Black Sea, and numerous ships passing by would stop to resupply. The core of the city was surrounded by a massive brick wall with many houses spilling outside. These ruins closely match Homer's description of the legendary city. There is one problem, however. Troy 6 was destroyed in 1300 BC, not by an invading army, but by a large earthquake. Upon these ruins, a smaller and far less grandiose city was built. As trade in the Mediterranean was slowly dying down in the later part of the 13th century, Troy 7a had no time to regain its former glory. The city limped along until it was sacked around 1180 BC. The archaeological evidence shows clear signs of a sustained siege, but it's impossible to tell how long it actually lasted. The true identity of the attackers also remains a mystery. Nothing had been found yet that would point us towards the Mycenaeans. Interestingly, Troy 7b shows signs of new inhabitants arriving from the Balkans. Did Troy share the fate of the great civilizations destroyed by the mysterious sea peoples, or did the Balkan refugees simply find the deserted ruins? When historians realized that the Iliad and the Odyssey had some truth to them, questions arose regarding the nature of the presented information. As archaeologists uncovered more evidence of the Mycenaeans, more and more details from the poems fell into place. Homer describes finely decorated palaces, bronze weapons, boar tusk helmets, figure-of-8 shields, war chariots, and many other accurate depictions of the Mycenaean world that were long gone by his time. On the other hand, he mentions funeral pyres. However, as we have already seen, the Mycenaeans buried their dead rather than burning them. Ritual pyres were common during the Dark Ages, but had been phased out by Homer's time. He also mentions some towns settled long after the collapse. From this, an interesting picture emerges. For generations, poets passed down the memory of a bygone era of heroes and kings, but with each subsequent generation, they embellished the story, incorporating elements from their own times. Gradually, the poems stopped being an accurate description of the past events and became an amalgamation of different customs and beliefs of the early Greeks. For historians, the most interesting part of the Iliad is the catalogue of ships, a comprehensive list of every Mycenaean settlement that took part in the war, along with the number of ships committed to the effort. In total, nearly 1,200 ships with over 140,000 men aboard are mentioned. This, however, is a gross overstatement. More noteworthy than the numbers are the mentioned Mycenaean settlements. Historians have successfully identified a significant proportion of them, giving some credence to the story. Several kingdoms are referenced in the catalogue, and these have been confirmed in the archaeological record. Their kings were mentioned by name, notably King Nestor of Pylos and Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, hailed as the high king of all Greeks. However, the historical record differs on this matter. There is no evidence that Pylos, or any other kingdom, was ever under the dominance of Mycenae. In addition to the epic cycle, there are other literary sources that mention Mycenaeans in Troy, though they are of completely foreign origins. East of the Aegean, in central Anatolia, stood the Hittite Empire. The Hittites were one of the great Bronze Age civilizations of the Near East. Among the discovered writings in the empire, there is mention of a city named Vilusa, located near the Hellespont. Eventually, it was confirmed that Vilusa was in fact Troy. Another name for Troy in early Greek dialects was Vilios. From these texts, we have discovered that Vilusa was conquered by the Hittites as far back as 1700 BC, serving as their vassal until the final days of the empire. The Hittites also refer to a people known as the Ahiavans, living in lands across the Western Sea. It is unclear whether Ahiava refers to Greeks as a whole or to one of the kingdoms, possibly Mycenae or Thebes. Archaeologists have found tablets mentioning the Vilusa incident, when a disobedient Greek general from Miletus harassed Vilusa. These texts reveal the history of conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans. None of these texts, however, mention a lengthy siege and the sack of Troy. But it wasn't just Troy that fell in that time. It was one city after another, one empire after another. Suddenly, around 1200 BC, the great Mycenaean palaces shared the same fate. Iolkos, Orchomenos, Thebes, Mycenae, Tyrannis, Menelaion, Pylos, and many others were all destroyed within a generation. The explanations for this widespread disaster vary widely. They can be divided into 4 distinct categories: foreign invasion, internal strife, natural disasters, or systems collapse. The first theory, put forth by the Greek authors themselves, was the Dorian invasion. According to myth, shortly after the Trojan War, a large group of Dorian Greeks moved onto the Peloponnese, destroying numerous cities in their path. Although this theory was popular with some early historians, modern archaeology can find no traces of a large migration of people. In fact, the signs point towards a migration out of the peninsula rather than towards it. The other candidate for the foreign threat are the mysterious Sea Peoples. They were a group of sea-borne raiders wreaking havoc across the eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age collapse. The Palace of Pylos shows some signs of an attack from the sea, but other Mycenaean citadels were unlikely to be bothered by the sea-borne raiders. It's possible that some Mycenaean refugees abandoned their great cities and sailed together with the Sea Peoples across the Mediterranean in search of new lands. But all they found were crumbling empires of the Near East, thus helping to bring an end to the Bronze Age. If we exclude foreign invasion, could the real enemy come from within? Linear B tablets reveal a distinct lack of the Doric dialect. This suggests that Dorians were a suppressed slave class. A series of slave revolts could explain the widespread destruction of the palaces with no evidence of an external threat. But what could have caused these revolts? It appears that the forces of nature, ever present in the Aegean, struck again. Around 1200 BC, a massive earthquake hit Argolid. Mycenae, Tyrannis, and Medea all show signs of extensive damage. As we have already seen, the people of the Aegean did not so easily surrender to nature. Great natural disasters were usually followed by new, even greater construction. But not this time. The Mycenaeans were a highly centralized, redistribution-based society. The collapse of this system would leave numerous people unable to sustain themselves, leading to widespread famines. The collapse of trade networks led to material shortages, particularly metals needed for bronze production. Although the destructions of palaces were all dated to around 1200 BC, evidence points to different localized events happening concurrently. The ultimate reason for the fall of Mycenaean Greece is therefore unknown. The likely explanation is a mix of all these factors. Additionally, the massive Hekla 3 eruption on Iceland caused rapid climate change and widespread famine, ensuring that the Mycenaeans had no opportunity to recover. It appears that one city in Greece did survive this apocalypse. Athens would emerge on the other side of the Dark Ages unscathed, a fact that classical Athenians would take great pride in. Join us next time as we discuss the Greek Dark Ages and the emergence of ancient Greece, which is still widely recognized today.